Welcome to today's webinar that we are talking about Key Stage 2 tests, the effective measures of school performance or a barrier to identifying children's needs. Today's webinar is sponsored by Testbase Standardised Tests, designed in partnership with the AQA to support teachers with high quality curriculum aligned assessment that build confidence in data diagnostics and decision making. Our main speaker today is Adam. Welcome, Adam.
Hi, Jonathan. Thanks for having me. How are you?
I'm all good, thank you. And currently, you're deputy head at Birkbeck Primary School, and you're also the founder of EdPulse, a great podcast. I've heard many of your episodes so far. I like the whole coaching methods that you talk about, and I'm a big advocate of what you're doing. So welcome, Adam.
Thanks very much indeed. Yeah, it's good to hear.
And could you just tell us a little bit about your background and what your role at Birkbeck Primary is and how that actually shapes your view on assessment?
Yeah, sure. So I'm in my 16th year of teaching now, and I still have a class teaching responsibility, which I think is really important for any leader. Over those kind of 16 years, I've had various roles within assessment, as I'm sure anybody that's kind of taught over 10 years kind of can relate to. At the moment at Birkbeck, I've kind of oversee teaching and learning as a whole, which would include assessment. Although I'm not the assessment lead, I do work closely with the assessment leader to make sure that assessment feeds into teaching and learning. And I think on the subject of assessment, that's probably my sort of core belief really, is it's all about understanding the relationship between assessment and teaching, rather than seeing assessment as like a necessary bolt-on that we do after the cool stuff, which is the teaching.
I say good. I mean, I follow the same sort of line. I've been in the trade for 30 years. Now, I've been assessment leader for quite a few years. So this is one of my favorite subjects is actually assessment, especially the assessment learning. And at this time of year, the results are coming out for the Key Stage 2 and all those statistics coming out for every school at this moment. But what I really want to focus on is the recent DFE survey that was done, actually saying that secondary schools don't actually use the Key Stage 2 SATs results as a guide to actually informing their learning. I think that's a missed opportunity. What do you feel about that whole survey?
Yeah, well, it's not a surprise, is it? I don't think. I think sort of anecdotally, we've kind of known for years, really, that that secondary schools don't use the SATs results in a practical sense, anyway, or largely don't use them in a practical sense. I do think that it's important to kind of acknowledge that in terms of setting flight paths from year 6 to year 11 and target grades and all of that kind of thing, and of course progress 8, there is kind of a mechanism built into the system that means that they are useful or not to secondary schools. But in terms of the day-to-day practical use of, how much information that I really want as a secondary school teacher do I get from the SATs results? Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much zero, isn't it? If you think about it from a secondary school teacher's point of view, or even I'm not even sure who it would be that would have access to them, but even if you're a head of department, like even if you're the head of department in maths, like what are you actually getting? You're getting a standardized scaled score that says this child has, got a scaled score of 109 or 108. They're technically a little bit better than what the average child would be in maths across the country, but it's not actually giving you anything useful. It's not telling you what do they understand at the moment, what do they not understand. Those are the two things really that create the link between assessment and teaching. And it seems that secondary school teachers don't get any access to that granularity of information.
No. So what would you suggest would be a good way forward then to connecting that more formative approach to secondary schools rather than the summative of the SATs results?
I love that. So we're like 5 minutes and 12 seconds in and we're already going for what's the solution. That is like, let's not mess around. Let's get straight to it. What should we be doing? I think, to be honest, I think probably where the solution needs to come from is in like a shared understanding of what assessment actually is all about. So we talk, there's a lot of phrases that get thrown around in the world of assessment, like formative assessment, summative assessment, assessment for learning, assessment of learning, assessment as learning. And I think like trying to get to a point where everybody understands all of these different terminologies and also what we mean by all of these things and get to a shared understanding. I think that's going to be really important before we could even kind of get to like, how do we change or how should the system be reshaped? So for example, like let's just pick up on one of those things. So this idea about formative assessment and summative assessment. So what that infers is that an assessment is either formative or it's summative. I don't think that's true. I think ultimately, like the assessment is the assessment. The formative or summative aspect of it is about the inferences that you draw. So I can look at an assessment that a child's done, and I can draw formative inferences, or I can draw summative inferences from that assessment. Right? Does that make sense?
That does. It's sort of like it's on a spectrum, really, isn't it? Sort of where you are on that formative and summative side, and actually, on some of the summative, you can still formulate what is the actual development for the child, basically what you're saying.
For sure. And I suppose then you go, okay, well, in that case, what's the point of a summative assessment? Let's start with that. Well, is it ever really important to know, like to have a judgment about where a child is at a particular stage in their learning? Like I would say, at a stage in their development, so at a particular age.
Okay.
See, I would argue that it probably is. I think it's quite useful for parents and also for secondary schools. Let's keep it in the context of SAT, to get a snapshot of, like, broadly speaking, what is this child's current level of competence in this particular subject. I think that has a use. I think the problem is that we expect that summative judgment to do more than what that summative judgment is actually able to do. Like a summative judgment is not designed to tell you what a child understands and what a child doesn't understand. And if we want a test to do that piece for us, then we need to look at drawing formative inferences from that test. And I guess my question then, in terms of like, if that's what we want, then we need to decide, well, how do we use these SATs tests? Because they're not going anywhere by all accounts. How do we use these SATs tests in a formative sense? That would be the question that I think everybody should sit around the table and start to think about how we could answer that.
I mean, that's a really good point. It's actually, how do you use it? And actually, if we're looking at where we are at this moment, they can be useful. The summative tests can be useful for a teacher to find out where things are, and sort of like, I'm just trying to think. Me as my year 6 teacher, I use quite a lot of the tests to actually work out precisely where every child was in the spectrum. And I did used to use Testbase to do that, and so I used to use all the questions, different types of questions, doing that. So going further from this, then it's sort of like, what's the next step from this? Then we can do the summative and the formative approach. What's next? How we can develop it as a school? Because basically, at the moment, we're talking to a load of school leaders. How do we then use that information to go further to inform secondary schools, to update? What does a child learning profile need to look like now? Long-winded question.
No, that's a really good one. It's a really good one. So, okay, so let's think then about like how we could use these SATs outcomes to inform secondary schools in a way that they would feel is valuable. Well, what we can do is we can use them to try to work out what a particular child doesn't understand at that given point. That's the most obvious thing and probably the most useful thing. The idea being that, you know, if 8 marks have been available for fractions and a child has got only 1 out of those 8 marks, we can start to draw an inference that perhaps that child has a lack of understanding in that particular domain of fractions, right? Now, we've got to be really careful that we hold that lightly, because we can't draw from that like an absolute certain conclusion that that child doesn't understand fractions, because it may, of course, have been the way that the question was phrased, or it may have been the fact that the question was right at the end of the paper and they didn't get to it. It may even have been that some of those questions they missed accidentally, right? So we would have to go down another layer of granularity to then check the accuracy of that inference. So I look at that top level and I go, okay, this child, 1 mark out of 8 in the domain of fractions. That suggests to me that maybe we've got a lack of understanding of that particular domain. Let's go down a layer. What does that look like? That looks like getting that child's test script out and looking at it and going, okay, so let me look at just these 8 questions, but for this particular child. And actually, can I see in here that there's a misconception around fractions that's kind of been embedded long ago, and that keeps coming up in all of these questions? Or actually, is it that, 3 of these questions were tabulated? Well, okay, if that's the case, let me look at other questions testing different domains that are also tabulated. How did the child do in those? Now, if a child has answered questions related to measurement and addition and subtraction that have been tabulated, but they've answered tabulated questions to do with fractions and they've got them wrong, that's further evidence that, okay, maybe what we have got here is actually a lack of understanding around the domain of fractions. But we've still got to go down another layer. If we really want this to be good, we've got to go down another layer again. We've got to look at this test script and have this conversation with this particular child. So we've got to sit them down and ask them to talk us through what they understand about the question, because it may well be that when they've read the question, they've misunderstood what the question's asking of them. Not in every single case, but it may well, that is definitely something that we'd have to check. So before we can get to like a really firm, certain inference about a child's lack of understanding in a particular domain, there's quite a lot of levels that we need to kind of go through before we can say that with any kind of certainty. The question then is, well, have secondary schools got the time to do that in September? Is that even the job of secondary schools? Like, probably not. Have primary schools got the opportunity to do that? Well, possibly. The results are going to come out on the 8th of July. So could we spend the last couple of weeks of primary school where teachers are spending time going through those test scripts with students and really trying to work out whether it's a lack of understanding of a particular concept, or whether it's the way the question was worded, or whether it's a stamina issue? Well, yeah, we could. But you could also argue that that's quite a sad way to spend your last couple of weeks of primary education as well. So there are no easy answers. And I think a lot of it comes back to like, how important is it that we get the information that we're talking about getting out of that kind of diagnostic process.
Yeah, and actually, how do you transfer that information? Because you probably have that information already, wouldn't you, before the actual test? So it's not, the test is not going to really give you that grounding of it, but it's actually that concept of, can they understand what part of the concept of fractions, for example, that you're going to be sharing with the secondary school to say, actually, they need more support with this. And as clear as that for the secondary school, and then the secondary school has to use that information to going through. So Testbase has introduced the standardized tests to work alongside SATs. How do you think these will better support teachers' assessment compared to the current system?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. You said a thing a moment ago. You probably already have that information before the test. I think to an extent that you do. The only thing that I would add to that, though, is that I do think there's a huge value in having some distance from initial teaching when you're assessing whether a child has understood something or not understood something. And personally, I do think that a test, a written test, a formal test, however you want to phrase it, the kinds of tests that Testbase have available there, I think they are really useful in terms of giving you that kind of snapshot. Because when you teach a child something in a lesson and then you send them away to go and do a bit of independent practice, and so you've got evidence in the book. Do you remember when we had you primary or secondary, Jonathan, originally? Primary.
I know what you're going to say.
Yeah, I'm going to say there's those 3 letters APP, right? So you'd go away and you'd highlight the APP grid, assessing people progress grid, showing that you've got evidence in the book that they can do the thing. Well, yeah, of course they can, because they were taught it, 27 seconds previously. So I do think we've got to build in this like a crucial aspect of whether we're actually able to provide secondary schools with any interesting information. So you have to have built in that distance from initial learning. And I think that the tests that Testbase have, those standardized tests, they provide you with an opportunity to test what you've taught with a distance from that initial teaching. And that's the same with any standardized test. I get that. But the thing I think that is important with or that's interesting, I think, with the test-based stuff is that because you've got so many other students across the country potentially using it because of Testbase's reach, you've got that kind of comparative judgment, right? So it's a little bit like if I give my group of students here a test tomorrow and they get 30 out of 50, I need to know if 30 out of 50 is any good or not. And there's no way that I can know that unless I'm standardizing that score against like a much wider cohort and working out what the kind of average score is for students across a wider demographic. So I think from a test-based perspective, you've got that standardized element to it, which those tests definitely bring. But then, as I say, it's then a case of still, can you go that stage lower? Can you really get to that point of information where they're actually telling you what students understand and what they don't understand?
Very good point. And actually, yeah, I remember the APP grids. Oh, how could I ever forget them? They were nightmares for some time. But the principle it's actually trying to work out what the child does know and what the child doesn't know, and actually have it as mapped out. But it went too far, and I think it's taken out of context of what it was designed to do in the first instance. But it sounds like the test-based standardized score is a good way forward. I can see it. If I was a year 6 teacher, I could see how I would be using it and actually how I would find that information, what you're saying, when from a distance when you've taught something, actually, do they actually understand it? Do they have that concept? Do they know how to use it? And can they do it in a test situation? So like, can they do it in a question situation?
Yeah, and I think that like the really key thing to mention here as well is we're talking about Key Stage 2 as a whole here. So, even if you take the test-based suite of assessments, that they start from year 3. And I think that like when we're talking about this this challenge of how do we make these tests do something useful for us, the testing ground for this is primary from year 3 right the way through to year 6. We have an opportunity for a year 3 teacher to give students a test of stuff that they've actually taught up to that point, right? So it's got to be stuff that they've actually taught, but then there's a distance between when it's been taught and when it's been tested. That gives that year 3 teacher a snapshot into what the child is likely to have understood or not understood at that point, because it's been taught, but there's been this delay in terms of when it was taught to when it was tested. That year 3 teacher can then pass that information on to the year 4 teacher. Now, I'm not sure that primary schools always get that transition right. Like, to what extent is a year 4 teacher using that information from the year 3 teacher about what students currently understand or don't understand? And to what extent are they actually using that to impact on their lessons, on their teaching? Now, I think, at my school, we've got a pretty good way of doing that. So at the end of the academic year, all of that information gets passed up from the end of year assessments, and the year 4 teacher receiving that class from year 3 will then use those gaps that the year 3 teacher has identified from that assessment, and they'll put those in as early morning work and as pre-lesson starters. So at the start of maths lessons in the autumn term, students will come in and they'll have questions based on those gaps from the end of the previous year. And what that does is it gives teachers an opportunity to just be continually noting down and noticing the extent to which students are then mastering content that they didn't have at the end of the previous year. Well, how do they do that? Because that sounds really onerous, right? But it's not. So you'd have like 4 questions on the board when kids come in the morning, and they're related to things that students have got gaps in from the previous year. The teacher's got the teacher's got a class list, and as they're doing their circulation, they're just ticking off and making comments against each child as they go around, each key children that they know had these gaps, ticking off and making notes about the extent to which that child's understanding is improved and whether that understanding appears to be secure in that particular moment. Once that understanding has been seen to be secure in 2, 3, 4 different occasions, I think at that point, that year 4 teacher can then go, great, that gap that they had at the end of year 3, I think we've closed that gap.
Sounds like a good plan. And what other tips do you have for any school leaders that are in this situation with assessment? What do you think is a key thing that they need to know about, and how they can implement it in schools?
Well, I think from a systems point of view, it would be things like I've just described, really. If you're going to have kids do tests and you want to use them for formative purposes, then you've got to build systems that incentivize teachers to actually make use of the information in the way that you want them to. So, as I say, if you're going to pass up to the year 4 teacher that, hey, at the end of year 3, they had these gaps in these areas that they'd been taught, you've then got to build a system that enables that year 4 teacher to keep coming back to those gaps, which is what I just described with that early morning work routine. It doesn't have to be that. You could do it at the start of maths lessons. You could do it first thing in the afternoon. There's lots of different ways that you could do it, but ultimately you need a system that incentivizes the next teacher to continually come back to those gaps that the previous teacher had identified. Then I think, aside from that, I think it's just a wider thing about how much do we actually understand assessment in primary school. Like, when we say assessment, do we all mean the same thing? And I don't think we necessarily do. So in my head, the way that I cut it is assessment for 3 reasons. So assessment of learning. So that would be a case of, like, I've taught this thing. Have they got it? Have they answered it right? And are they broadly in line with where other students of their age at this point in the year across the country are? So that would be where you'd use the test-based standardized resources, because that tells me, how my kids are doing in comparison to other kids across the country. So that's your assessment assessment of learning. Then you've got your assessment for learning. So that's where I'm actually looking specifically for the gaps. So what do they not understand? I'm not actually as interested there about what they understand. I'm looking for what they don't understand. And then that informs what I do right here in the moment of this particular lesson. So, for example, when I put up a question on the board, I ask kids to answer it on their mini whiteboards and then show me. I think what a lot of teachers do, and I think this is totally natural, is you're kind of scanning the room like this, looking for how many right answers you've got, to be like, yeah, I've taught that well, great. Actually, I think the most useful thing to be doing there, to use that for assessment for learning, is to scan for the incorrect answers or for the potential misconceptions. And then in that moment, you're then responding to that and reteaching it. And the third way is assessment as learning. So just by the very fact of doing the assessment, of answering the question, students are having to work really hard to pull information they've got in long-term memory from when they were originally taught it into their working memory. And we know that the more often students do that, the more secure that knowledge becomes, the more easily retrievable it becomes, and therefore the more useful that information or that knowledge becomes for them. So assessment as learning would be doing the assessment because it improves learning in and of itself. So you've got 3 different purposes of assessment there. And I think that something that school leaders should definitely do with their staff is kind of define what those different uses of assessment are and what they look like in practice.
That'd be a good point. I mean, that's definitely going to be a staff meeting for the new year, isn't it, really? Clarifying everything on assessment. And actually, how often do schools do staff meetings on the background of assessment? They do a lot on collecting the data and do that, but actually talking about assessment and what it means and how you can use it. I think that'd be quite an interesting one for doing. So at the moment, we've got a lot of change in education. We've got this sort of like Professor Becky Francis doing a whole curriculum and assessment reform. What would you like to see as a model for assessment going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one. I think at scale, I think that assessments are. So I think that fundamentally we've got to get a shared understanding across the sector of the different purposes. So if we are getting, and we don't have to cut it this way, but if you just come back to that idea of assessment as learning, assessment for learning, assessment of learning, a shared understanding of those 3 different purposes would mean that when teachers are in their classrooms making decisions about either what to teach or what to test, they understand why they're making those decisions and the basis that they're making those decisions under. They're connected to the purpose. So I'm doing this test as learning. Right? And you see that quite a lot. So for example, I see sometimes teachers will be doing lesson starters, and it's on stuff that students have been taught previously, but they're now getting pretty strong at. Like times tables, for example, are a real classic. Like the number of lessons that start with a times table quiz or something like that, particularly in year 3 or year 4. Well, actually, like you could make an argument that if you're using that as assessment as learning, you don't want to spend a ton of time taking in the answers, showing kids what the answers are, ticking in itself. If the purpose is assessment as learning, and therefore students have got what they needed to get out of that simply by doing the test, then the answers are less important. If you're doing assessment for learning, i.e. looking for the gaps. So let's say I'm doing that same lesson starter, that same times table starter, and I want to know where the gaps are. Well, now it becomes really important that I do provide feedback, but I'm providing feedback on those common misconceptions. So like, oh, okay, it seems that we've got a bit of an issue with the 9 times table. Let's go over that again now. So again, my action that I take off the back of it is driven by my purpose. And I think that's what I would like to see sitting at the heart and soul of an assessment approach going across the sector. It's that understanding that when we talk about assessment, we're not talking about summative tests alone. We're talking about these 3 core uses of assessment, and actually how good are we at deciding and knowing which of those 3 purposes we're pulling on at any given time.
Be a good point. And from what I hear, they're probably going to be more onto that sort of like sign of how we're using the assessment. So it'd be a good thing. I mean, going back to that survey, one of the other criticisms was is about the multiplication test and the phonics screening. Actually, that's one of the big issues was, do they work? Do they actually help learning? But I think really what the questions for those tests is not about the test, it's about what you do after it. It's sort of like, how do you use the information from those to actually help what you're doing?
Yeah, and I think, again, like the question, it's an interesting question. Do the tests help learning? Yeah, I think they do. Because like in the purest sense, because by taking a test on something that I've been taught, I have to think hard about that thing. And it's the thinking hard about it that strengthens my understanding of that concept. So do they help learning? Yeah. Is that the end of the story? No, definitely shouldn't be. Because if I then switch purposes and I'm going, okay, so I'm happy that the test does its job for assessment as learning. I'm happy that the test does its job in terms of assessment of learning. Think about the MTC. You know, it's useful for me to know whether a kid has got 25 out of 25 or 23 out of 25, whatever it might be, because I want to know like their general competence level at the end of year 4. If that's important information to me, then yeah, it's done that job. But now let's switch purposes again to assessment for learning. Well, is it doing that part of the job? Well, that really depends on what happens next. And that comes back to your point, which is about the extent to which we are passing up the information that matters in an effective way. And I don't think we're doing that at the moment as a sector from year 4 to year 5, let alone from year 6 to year 7.
Yeah, it's a good point. And so like to closing up on this webinar today, what one message would you give to school leaders about assessment?
Sorry, you dropped out there, Jonathan. I lost you for a while. Sorry, what was that last question?
So to closing up this webinar, what one question or one message would you give to all school leaders about assessment?
I think the message for all school leaders, right? So we know that we've got a system at the moment with assessment that doesn't do that particular job particularly well. That assessment for learning bit, it doesn't do that particularly well as a system. So I'm not here talking about I'm not talking about systems that people might have in their individual schools, because there is some great practice in that area. But as a system, are we communicating from one teacher to the next or from one school to the next what students don't understand, so that information can then be used by the next teacher? I don't think we are using that. I don't think we're doing that particular job particularly well. And so my message would be that if we want to change that particular thing, if we want to change that problem, we've all got to come together to try and construct a solution around that. So my question would be, how is it that we can create a system that that values that information going up to secondary schools? How is it that we can create a system that gives secondary schools that information in a digestible way? The only way we're going to do that is to be able to have more cross-sector conversation. And I think that would be what I would implore school leaders to do, really, would be school leaders from primary and secondary, get yourselves in the same room, talk about the information that secondary schools actually want, and then set about providing that information for them in a way that's digestible and efficient.
Sounds great. So thank you very much, Adam. I'm really grateful for your honest and thoughtful reflections on assessment, and really useful conversation there on what we should be doing and how we can move it forward. Today's webinar was brought to you in partnership with Testbase, and those new Testbase standard tests were designed to help the whole school tracking to strengthen confidence on termly data and develop formative teaching responses. For more information, go to www.testbase.co.uk, and hopefully we will see you again soon.
Thanks very much indeed, Jonathan.
Thank you, Adam.